22,000 German soldiers. Gone. In just 2 days. Hitler had given his commanders 14 days to stop the Canadian advance. They couldn't hold for 48 hours. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Canadians weren't the Americans with their endless resources, weren't the Soviets with their human waves, weren't even the British with their imperial prestige. They were the quiet ones, the polite ones, the ones everyone underestimated. And that miscalculation would cost the Wehrmacht one of its most catastrophic defeats on the Western Front. October 1944. The war was supposed to be ending. The Allies had landed in Normandy, liberated Paris, pushed deep into France. Victory felt inevitable, just a matter of time. But there was a problem. A massive, strategic problem that threatened to derail the entire Allied advance and extend the war for months, maybe years. The port of Antwerp. Antwerp was the second largest port in Europe, capable of handling thousands of tons of supplies every single day. The Allies desperately needed it. Their supply lines stretched all the way back to Normandy beaches, a logistical nightmare that was strangling their offensive capabilities. Tanks were running out of fuel. Artillery batteries were rationing shells. Infantry divisions were short on everything from ammunition to medical supplies. Taking Antwerp itself had been relatively easy. British forces had captured the city almost intact on September 4th. The port facilities were undamaged, the docks ready to receive ships. There was just one tiny problem. The Scheldt estuary. To reach Antwerp, ships had to sail 60 miles up the Scheldt River, through an estuary controlled entirely by German forces. The Wehrmacht had fortified every inch of it, turned it into a death trap of bunkers, artillery positions, flooded fields, and heavily defended islands. As long as the Germans controlled the Scheldt, Antwerp was useless. A beautiful prize that couldn't be used. And the task of clearing it fell to the 1st Canadian Army. Not that anyone expected much from them. The Germans certainly didn't. German intelligence reports from October 1944 dismissed the Canadians as exhausted, depleted, second-rate troops. After the brutal fighting in Normandy and the race across France, the Canadian divisions were supposedly burned out, filled with green replacements, lacking the punch for a major offensive. Some German commanders didn't even think they'd attack seriously. Maybe they'd probe, test the defenses, wait for British reinforcements. The veterans of the Eastern Front, the officers who'd fought at Stalingrad and Kursk, they especially looked down on these colonials from across the Atlantic. Hitler himself was confident. When he reviewed the defensive positions along the Scheldt, he calculated that the Canadians would need at least 2 weeks to make any meaningful progress. 2 weeks minimum. His generals agreed. The terrain favored defense perfectly. The Germans had flooded huge areas, turning the landscape into an impassable swamp where tanks would bog down and infantry would drown. The few dry approaches were covered by interlocking fields of fire. Bunkers made from reinforced concrete that could withstand naval bombardment. Artillery positions hidden in towns and farms. Thousands of mines. And manning these defenses were some quality troops, the 64th Infantry Division, the 70th Infantry Division, units that had combat experience and motivation. The Canadians had something else. Something the Germans hadn't accounted for. They had rage. See, the Canadian Army in 1944 wasn't the same force that had landed in Sicily back in 1943. They'd seen things. They'd liberated French towns where the SS had massacred civilians. They'd found concentration camps. They'd seen what happened to prisoners of war who fell into the wrong hands. They'd watched friends die in Normandy hedgerows, cut down by teenagers in SS uniforms who'd been taught to die rather than surrender. And they'd learned something crucial from fighting the Germans for over a year. The Wehrmacht respected strength and punished weakness. So the Canadians decided to show them strength. The operation began on October 2, 1944. Not with the main assault but with a deception. Canadian units made obvious preparations to attack from the south, building up supplies, moving artillery into position, conducting reconnaissance patrols. German intelligence took the bait. They reinforced the southern approaches, shifted reserves, prepared for the assault they expected. The real attack came from a completely different direction. On October 6, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division struck at the Breskens Pocket, a fortified German position on the southern shore of the Scheldt. This wasn't a probing attack. This wasn't a careful advance. This was a hammer blow designed to shatter the German line in hours, not days. The assault began at 5:30 a.m. with an artillery barrage that turned the sky orange. Over 300 guns, everything from field artillery to heavy naval guns from ships offshore, poured fire onto German positions. The bombardment was so intense that German soldiers in the bunkers couldn't hear themselves scream. The ground shook like an earthquake. Concrete cracked. Wooden beams splintered. Men's ears bled from the concussion. For 45 minutes, the world ended in fire and steel. Then the infantry went in. Canadian soldiers, many of them barely 20 years old, charged through flooded fields where the water came up to their chests. They carried rifles above their heads, waded through minefields, pushed through barbed wire while machine guns tore into their ranks. They didn't stop. When men fell, others took their place. When officers died, sergeants took command. When sergeants died, corporals stepped up. The momentum never broke. The Germans had expected a cautious advance, methodical clearing of defenses, the British style of warfare. Instead, they got something that looked more like a Soviet human wave attack, except these weren't poorly trained conscripts. These were professional soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing, using tactics they perfected over 2 years of combat. Small unit tactics. Fire and movement. Aggressive flanking maneuvers. They didn't fight like they wanted to survive. They fought like they wanted to win. By noon on the first day, Canadian forces had penetrated 3 miles into German defenses. Positions that were supposed to hold for days fell in hours. The 64th Infantry Division, which had been confident that morning, was in full retreat by evening. German radio intercepts showed panic. Officers were calling for reinforcements that didn't exist, artillery support that couldn't be provided, permission to withdraw that was denied. Hitler's orders were absolute. Hold every position. Not one step back. Fight to the last man. The Canadians were happy to accommodate that order. The second day was worse for the Germans. Much worse. Canadian armor had found gaps in the defenses, weak points that intelligence had identified through aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogation. Sherman tanks, supported by infantry, punched through and started rolling up the German line from the flanks. German soldiers who'd never seen Canadian forces in action learned a brutal lesson. These weren't the colonials they'd been told about. These were killers. There's a story that circulated among German survivors, never confirmed but widely believed. A Canadian officer, when asked by a surrendering German why the Canadians fought with such ferocity, supposedly replied, "You started this in Poland. We're finishing it in Holland." By October 8, just 48 hours after the main assault began, the German defensive line had collapsed. Not bent, not strained. Collapsed. Units that had been at full strength 2 days earlier had ceased to exist as fighting formations. The 64th Infantry Division had lost over 70% of its combat strength. Survivors were streaming back in disorder, abandoning equipment, weapons, everything that would slow them down. And then came the surrenders. German soldiers, exhausted, out of ammunition, cut off from their supply lines, started giving up in massive numbers. First in squads, then platoons, then entire companies. Officers who'd been told to fight to the death were walking forward with white flags. Bunkers that could have held for days were surrendering after token resistance. The Canadian advance had broken something fundamental in the German defenders. Not just their defenses but their will. The numbers were staggering. In the first week of fighting, the Canadians captured over 12,000 German prisoners. By the end of October, when the Breskens pocket was finally cleared, that number had risen to 22,000. 22,000 German soldiers, an entire division's worth of manpower, removed from the battlefield. The equivalent of wiping out 2 or 3 full-strength divisions. Gone. Captured. Sitting in POW cages. For context, that's more prisoners than the Germans lost in some entire months on the Eastern Front. It's comparable to the numbers captured during major Soviet offensives. Except this wasn't the Red Army with millions of men. This was the Canadian Army, a force that numbered around 175,000 men total in Northwest Europe. Proportionally, it was one of the most successful operations of the entire war. But here's what made it truly remarkable. The casualties. Modern military doctrine suggests that attacking forces need a 3-to-1 advantage to successfully assault prepared defensive positions. The Canadians were attacking some of the most formidable defenses in Western Europe, fortifications that the Germans had spent months preparing, across terrain that favored the defender completely. By all logic, they should have taken massive casualties. Tens of thousands dead and wounded. Total Canadian casualties for the entire Scheldt campaign, including the fighting after those first 48 hours? Around 12,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Horrific by any measure, each one a tragedy. But against fortified positions across flooded terrain, fighting determined defenders? Military analysts expected double that number. Triple it. The Germans certainly expected to inflict far heavier losses. So what happened? How did the Canadians achieve what the Germans thought impossible? First, intelligence. Canadian reconnaissance had been meticulous. They'd used aerial photography, captured documents, prisoner interrogation, civilian reports from the Dutch resistance. They knew where every German strongpoint was located, where the artillery batteries were hidden, where the minefields had been laid. When the attack came, there were no surprises. The Canadians knew exactly what they were hitting. Second, firepower. The artillery barrage wasn't just for show. It was scientifically calculated to destroy specific targets. Every gun had been registered, every battery had its assigned targets, every shell was aimed to maximize damage. The naval support from British warships added heavy guns that could crack open the strongest bunkers. German survivors talked about the bombardment with something approaching awe. They'd never experienced anything like it, not even veterans of the Eastern Front. Third, combined arms warfare. The Canadians didn't just send infantry charging into machine gun fire. Every attack was coordinated between infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air support. Tanks suppressed bunkers while infantry flanked them. Engineers cleared mines while artillery kept German heads down. Fighter bombers struck German reserves before they could reinforce. It was warfare as a symphony, every element playing its part perfectly. Fourth, and perhaps most important, experience and aggression. By October 1944, the Canadian Army was arguably one of the most experienced Allied forces in Europe. They'd fought in Sicily, Italy, Normandy, France. They'd learned from every battle, adapted their tactics, studied what worked and what didn't. And they developed a reputation for aggression that terrified German defenders. When Canadians attacked, they didn't stop. They didn't consolidate. They kept pushing, kept exploiting, kept driving forward until the enemy broke. There's a German after-action report from a battalion commander in the 64th Division that survived the war. In it, he describes the Canadian attacks with something that reads like shock. He writes about how Canadian infantry would assault positions that should have been impregnable, how they'd take casualties and keep coming, how they'd bypass strongpoints and attack from unexpected directions, how they seemed to anticipate every German countermove. He concludes by stating that his men, veterans of the Eastern Front, considered the Canadians to be more dangerous than the Soviets because they combined Soviet aggression with American firepower and British tactical sophistication. High praise from an enemy who had every reason to be bitter. But the story doesn't end with the Breskins' pocket. That was just the beginning. While the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division was crushing German resistance in the south, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division was preparing an even more audacious assault in the north. The island of Walcheren. Walcheren was a fortress. Literally. The Germans had turned the entire island into a massive defensive position, with concrete bunkers, artillery casemates, coastal guns, anti-aircraft batteries, and over 10,000 troops. The island controlled the northern approaches to the Scheldt, and as long as the Germans held it, the waterway remained closed. The Canadians had a plan. An insane, brilliant, terrifying plan. They were going to flood the island. RAF bombers had already attacked the sea dikes protecting Walcheren, breaching them in multiple places. Seawater had rushed in, flooding about 70% of the island's interior. The Germans were now isolated on the remaining high ground, their positions turned into island strongholds surrounded by water. Which meant the Canadians couldn't use their tanks effectively. Couldn't bring up heavy artillery. Couldn't employ most of their normal advantages. So they improvised. On November 1, 1944, Canadian and British commandos launched an amphibious assault on Walcheren using landing craft and specialized armored vehicles. It was D-Day in miniature, except the defenders were ready, alert, and dug in. The beaches were covered by overlapping fields of fire from bunkers that had survived the flooding. Coastal artillery could target any boat before it reached shore. Mines filled the water. It should have been a massacre. It wasn't. The commandos hit the beaches at dawn under heavy fire. German machine guns cut through the first waves, but the Canadians kept coming. Specialized tanks, Churchill AVREs equipped with massive mortars, fired directly into bunker slits. Flamethrower tanks burned defenders out of positions. Infantry rushed forward through the water, some of them swimming the last 50 meters because their landing craft had been sunk. They took the beaches through sheer bloody-minded determination, established a foothold and started pushing inland. Or what passed for inland on an island that was mostly underwater. The fighting on Walcheren became surreal. Canadian troops advancing through chest-deep water, pushing inflatable boats and rafts ahead of them. Firefights in flooded villages where both sides were wading through water. Artillery battles where the guns themselves stood on tiny islands of dry ground. It was unlike anything anyone had experienced in the war. And the Canadians were winning. German defenders fought hard. Credit where it's due. They knew they were trapped, knew there was no escape, knew that surrender meant POW camps for the duration. Many chose to fight. But isolated, cut off, running low on ammunition and supplies they couldn't hold. Position after position fell to Canadian assaults. Strong points that could have held for weeks fell in days. The Germans on Walcheren surrendered on November 8. Another 8,000 prisoners. Another German division effectively destroyed. The Scheldt was open. The strategic impact was immediate and massive. By late November, the first Allied supply ships were sailing up the Scheldt to Antwerp. By December, the port was handling over 19,000 tons of supplies every single day. The logistical crisis that had been strangling the Allied advance was solved. American armies that had been stalled for lack of fuel could advance again. British forces got the ammunition they needed. The entire Allied offensive in Northwest Europe was revitalized. And it was all because the Canadians had done in weeks what the Germans thought would take months. What Hitler had confidently predicted would take at least 2 weeks, the Canadians had shattered in 48 hours. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was profound. If the Canadians could do this, what would happen when the full might of the Allied armies hit the Rhine? When the Soviets renewed their offensive in the east? The myth of the impregnable German defense had been broken. There's a quote from a Canadian soldier after the battle, a private from Regina, Saskatchewan. When asked how they'd done it, how they'd achieved what seemed impossible, he shrugged and said, "We just figured it needed doing, so we did it." That Canadian understatement, that refusal to see themselves as heroes, was perhaps the most dangerous thing about them from the German perspective. They didn't fight for glory. They fought to get the job done. The German casualties told a story that no propaganda could spin. 22,000 prisoners in the Breskin's pocket. 8,000 on Walcheren. Thousands more killed or wounded. Entire divisions annihilated. And this was against an army that Germany had dismissed as colonial second-raters, farmers playing soldier, not worthy of serious concern. The Canadians proved otherwise in blood and fire. But here's what often gets forgotten in the statistics and the strategic assessments. These were real people. Young men, most of them in their early 20s, who'd volunteered to cross an ocean and fight in someone else's war because they believed it was right. They came from farms in Saskatchewan, fishing villages in Nova Scotia, logging towns in British Columbia, cities like Toronto and Montreal. They weren't professional warriors. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. There's a letter that survived, written by a Canadian corporal to his mother after the Scheldt. He describes wading through water so cold his feet went numb, being shot at by snipers he couldn't see, watching friends die in the flooded fields. But he also describes the moment when a German position surrendered, when the white flags came out, when the shooting stopped. He writes that he didn't feel victorious or proud. He just felt tired and relieved that it was over, at least for that day. He mentions hoping that maybe with Antwerp open the war would end sooner. That maybe he'd be home for Christmas 1945. He was. The war ended in May and he returned to Canada that fall. Went back to his job, married his girlfriend, raised a family, and rarely talked about what he'd done in Holland. Like so many veterans, he just wanted to move on, to forget. The nightmares of fighting through flooded fields, the faces of friends who didn't make it home, the weight of what they'd accomplished and what it had cost. But the Dutch remembered. Oh, how they remembered. In the Netherlands, Canadian soldiers are still revered as liberators. Schools teach about the Scheldt campaign. Towns and cities honor the Canadians who died freeing them. Every year, Dutch citizens tend to the graves of Canadian soldiers, leaving flowers, saying prayers, ensuring they're not forgotten. There's a deep bond between Canada and the Netherlands that stems directly from those terrible weeks in October and November 1944, when Canadians bled in Dutch fields to free a country most of them had never seen before. Princess Juliana of the Netherlands spent the war in exile in Canada. When she had a daughter in 1943, born in Ottawa, the Canadian government declared the hospital room extraterritorial so the princess would be born on Dutch soil and maintain her place in the line of succession. That daughter, Princess Margriet, was named after the Marguerite daisy, which became a symbol of the Dutch-Canadian friendship. Every year since 1945, the Netherlands sends tulips to Canada as a thank you. Over 20,000 tulip bulbs every single year, planted in Ottawa, a reminder of blood spilled and lives saved. The Germans learned a different lesson. Don't underestimate the quiet ones. Don't assume that politeness means weakness. Don't think that colonials can't fight as hard as anyone else. The Wehrmacht made those mistakes and it cost them 30,000 men, control of one of Europe's most important ports, and any hope of stopping the Allied advance into Germany. Hitler's 2-week timeline had been shattered in 48 hours. His Atlantic Wall, his Fortress Europe, his Thousand-Year Reich, all of it was crumbling. And it was guys from places like Moose Jaw and Medicine Hat who were doing the crumbling, small-town boys who'd probably never left their home province before the war, who'd learned to fight in the harshest school imaginable and become masters of their craft. The Battle of the Scheldt doesn't get the recognition it deserves in popular history. It's overshadowed by D-Day, by the Battle of the Bulge, by the March to Berlin. But in terms of strategic impact, in terms of what it enabled, it was one of the most important Allied victories of the entire war. Without Antwerp, the Allied offensive would have stalled. Without the offensive, the war might have dragged into 1946, with hundreds of thousands more casualties, more cities destroyed, more atrocities committed. The Canadians prevented that. They kicked open the door that had been holding up the Allied advance. And they did it with a combination of courage, skill, determination, and a willingness to pay the price that victory demanded. When the German commanders sat in their prisoner of war camps, comparing notes on what had gone wrong, they kept coming back to the same point. They'd underestimated the Canadians. Thought they were second-rate. Thought they'd be easy to stop. By the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The Canadian First Army had smashed through defenses that were supposed to be impregnable, captured more prisoners in a month than some armies captured in a year, and opened the way for the final Allied push into Germany. Hitler had given the Wehrmacht 2 weeks. The Canadians had needed 48 hours. The remaining 12 days were just cleanup, mopping up the shattered remnants of German divisions that had thought they were safe behind their flooded fields and concrete bunkers. They weren't safe. Not from these particular colonials. Not from young men who'd crossed an ocean to fight fascism, who'd learned their trade in the mountains of Italy and the hedgerows of Normandy, who'd become one of the most effective fighting forces in the Allied armies. The Germans dismissed them right up until the moment Canadian infantry came through their wire, Canadian tanks rolled over their positions, Canadian artillery turned their bunkers into tombs. The aftermath of the Scheldt campaign sent shockwaves through the German high command. Field reports filtering back to Berlin painted a picture that contradicted everything they'd been told about Allied capabilities. One after-action report from a surviving German colonel described the Canadian tactics as relentlessly professional, impossibly aggressive, and executed with a precision that suggests extensive combat experience against first-rate opponents. This wasn't the language used to describe second-tier colonial troops. This was respect born from defeat. German intelligence agencies scrambled to understand what had happened. How had their estimates been so catastrophically wrong? The answer, buried in classified documents that would only surface after the war, was simple and damning. They'd relied on outdated assessments, propaganda about Canadian inexperience, and their own prejudices about colonial forces. Nobody had bothered to update the intelligence files with information from Sicily, from Italy, from Normandy. Nobody had interviewed the German soldiers who'd actually fought Canadians and survived to tell about it. The Wehrmacht had defeated itself through arrogance before the first shot was fired. But for the Canadians who'd done the actual fighting, there was no time for celebration. The Scheldt had been cleared, but the war continued. Men who'd just survived one of the most brutal campaigns in Western Europe history were immediately transferred to new sectors. New battles, new nightmares. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division moved into position for the assault on the Rhineland. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division prepared for operations in northern Holland. There were no parades, no medal ceremonies, no recognition beyond a brief mention in newspapers back home that most Canadians would never read. The soldiers themselves processed what they'd accomplished in different ways. Some wrote letters home that censors would cut to pieces, removing any mention of locations or casualties. Others sat in silence, smoking cigarettes, staring at nothing. A few tried to joke about it, dark humor being the only way to cope with having waded through water filled with bodies, having shot teenagers who wouldn't surrender, having watched friends drown in flooded shell craters. One Canadian sergeant, a 23-year-old from a farm outside Winnipeg, kept a journal despite regulations against it. His entry from November 9th, the day after Walcheren fell, is heartbreaking in its simplicity. It's over. The Scheldt is ours. Jimmy didn't make it. Neither did Corporal Davies or most of 2nd Platoon. We won. Doesn't feel like winning. Just feels like we're still alive and they're not. Can't think about it too much or I'll go crazy. Orders came down. We move out tomorrow. More fighting ahead. Always more fighting. That sergeant would survive the war, return to Canada in 1946, and never speak of the Scheldt to his children. When his grandson asked him decades later if he'd done anything important during the war, he'd replied, "I did my job. That's all." The grandson would only learn about the Battle of the Scheldt years after his grandfather's death, reading a history book and realizing that the quiet farmer who'd raised chickens and complained about the weather had been part of one of the most significant Allied victories of World War II. For the Dutch civilians who'd survived German occupation and the battle itself, the Canadians were nothing short of miraculous. Towns that had been under Nazi control for 4 years were suddenly free. German soldiers who'd terrorized the population were gone, marching into POW camps under Canadian Guard. Food supplies that the Wehrmacht had hoarded were distributed to starving civilians. The psychological impact of liberation was profound, and it was Canadians who delivered it. There are countless stories of Dutch families who risked their lives hiding Canadian soldiers who'd been cut off from their units, providing them with civilian clothes, food, intelligence about German positions. When the fighting ended, those same families threw open their homes to exhausted Canadian troops, sharing what little they had, expressing gratitude that no words could adequately convey. Bonds were formed in those days that would last generations. One Dutch woman, who'd been 17 when the Canadians liberated her village near the Scheldt, would later write in her memoir, "We'd heard the artillery for days, getting closer. We didn't know if we'd survive. The Germans were desperate, unpredictable. Then one morning there was silence. And then we saw them. Young men in different uniforms, speaking English, smiling despite the exhaustion in their eyes. They gave us chocolate. Can you imagine? In the middle of a war, after fighting through hell to reach us, they gave children chocolate. We knew then that we were truly free." The strategic consequences of the Scheldt victory rippled through the entire Allied command structure. General Eisenhower, who'd been dealing with the supply crisis for months, finally had the logistics he needed to plan the final push into Germany. Field Marshal Montgomery, who'd argued for a concentrated thrust into the Ruhr, now had the supply base to make it possible. General Patton, whose Third Army had been stalled in eastern France due to fuel shortages, could resume his advance. The entire Allied war effort shifted into high gear because young Canadians had fought through flooded fields and cracked open a port. The numbers tell part of the story. By January 1945, Antwerp was handling over 800,000 tons of supplies monthly. That's ammunition for artillery barrages, fuel for tank divisions, food for millions of soldiers, medical supplies for field hospitals, spare parts for vehicles, everything an army needs to function. Without Antwerp, the Allies couldn't have launched the Rhineland offensive. Without the Rhineland offensive, the crossing of the Rhine would have been delayed. Without crossing the Rhine, the end of the war in Europe would have been pushed back months. Military historians have calculated that the Battle of the Scheldt shortened World War II by at least 3 months, possibly 6. Every day the war continued meant more Holocaust victims murdered in concentration camps, more cities bombed, more soldiers killed, more civilians caught in the crossfire. By that metric, the Canadians who fought at the Scheldt saved hundreds of thousands of lives through their sacrifice. But the human cost was real and lasting. The 12,000 Canadian casualties included over 6,000 dead and missing. That's 6,000 families who received telegrams informing them their sons, husbands, fathers wouldn't be coming home. 6,000 empty chairs at dinner tables. 6,000 futures erased. Small towns across Canada lost entire graduating classes of young men. The impact on communities was devastating, wounds that would take generations to heal. The German prisoners, meanwhile, faced their own reckoning. 22,000 men who'd been told they were defending the fatherland, fighting for a glorious cause, suddenly found themselves behind barbed wire, guarded by the colonials they'd been taught to despise. Many were relieved. The war was over for them. No more artillery barrages, no more fighting through flooded fields, no more watching friends die for positions that couldn't be held. Others felt shame at having surrendered, having failed the Reich, having proven themselves inferior to supposedly inferior opponents. Interrogation reports from German POWs captured at the Scheldt reveal a consistent theme. Shock at the intensity of Canadian attacks, respect for their tactical competence, and bewilderment at having been so thoroughly defeated. One German lieutenant, when asked what could have changed the outcome, replied simply, "Nothing. We were told we faced second-rate troops. We faced some of the best soldiers in the Allied armies. We never had a chance." That assessment wasn't propaganda or self-justification. It was the truth. By October 1944, the Canadian Army had evolved into a precision instrument of warfare, combining the best elements of British tactical doctrine, American industrial firepower, and their own hard-won experience. They'd learned from every battle, adapted to every challenge, and developed an institutional competence that rivaled any army in the world. The tragedy is that this story isn't better known. Ask random people about World War II's most important battles, and they'll mention Stalingrad, D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, maybe Midway or El Alamein. The Battle of the Scheldt rarely makes the list, despite its strategic significance. It's been called the forgotten victory, the battle that changed everything but gets overshadowed by flashier operations. Part of that is Canadian culture itself. Canada doesn't mythologize its military history the way some nations do. There's no Canadian equivalent to the American World War II narrative of saving the world, no triumphant story of empire like Britain tells. Canadians tend toward understatement, toward letting actions speak louder than words. The soldiers who fought at the Scheldt came home, took off their uniforms and went back to being farmers, factory workers, teachers, shopkeepers. They didn't talk about what they'd done because talking about it meant reliving it, and reliving it was too painful. But the silence did a disservice to history. Future generations of Canadians grew up not knowing that their grandparents had accomplished something remarkable, that small-town kids from across Canada had shattered Hitler's timetable and helped end the war months earlier than it might have otherwise ended. The story was there, buried in archives and fading memories, waiting for someone to tell it properly. And the lesson remains relevant. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never assume that politeness equals weakness. Never think that people who'd rather avoid conflict can't fight like demons when pushed to it. The Germans learned this lesson the hard way in the flooded fields of the Scheldt estuary, and it cost them 30,000 casualties they couldn't afford, control of a port they desperately needed to deny the Allies, and any remaining hope that they could stop the inevitable advance into the heart of Germany. Hitler's 2-week prediction had been arrogant and catastrophically wrong. His Wehrmacht, despite its experience and training and ideological fanaticism, couldn't hold for 48 hours against an army it had dismissed as irrelevant. The Canadians proved that determination, skill and courage matter more than propaganda and prejudice. They proved that underestimating your enemy is a fatal mistake. They proved that sometimes the people everyone overlooks are the ones who change history. 22,000 German prisoners in 48 hours. One shattered prediction. One open port that changed the course of the war. And a reminder that echoes through the decades. The Canadians were there, they fought, they won, and the world is better because they did.